Hi everyone, good evening. Thanks so much for joining us here at the Seminary Co-op. We're so pleased to welcome Lester K. Spence in conversation tonight with Michael C. Dawson. Both their books are up at the register, available after reading. We're so glad you're here, and we're so thankful that you're here, and thankful for the support of our co-sponsor tonight, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. I want to let you know just about a couple of upcoming events we have this spring season. Starting next week on Tuesday, March 8th, we'll welcome Shaka Singer. He's an advocate for criminal justice reform and an author of the book Righting My Wrongs, Life, Death, and Redemption in an American Prison. That'll be here at the Co-op on Tuesday, March 8th. And then on March 15th, Matt Desmond, an author who spent a couple of years up in Milwaukee doing kind of field research with 8 different families who had been recently evicted from their homes. He'll be talking about his brand new book, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City on March 15th. And then at the end of this next month, on March 31st, in another event we're co-sponsoring with CSRPC, we'll welcome WBEZ's Natalie Moore. She'll be in conversation with Brooke Pearlstein about her brand new book, The South Side, A Portrait of Chicago and American Segregation. And that event will be held over at International House here on campus. If you'd like any more information about our events, please feel free to sign up at the register for our events email newsletter. And you can also do that online on our website at semgroup.com. I'll get out of your way. Thank you again for being here on such a climactic night, a Chicago night, right? What else will we be doing? And please join me in welcoming Lester K. Spence and Michael C. Dawson.
Thank you. Should we just get into it?
Oh, let's do this.
Okay, so you're in my hometown, but I want to talk about yours for a second. So, two of the elders, two of the leading figures in black political thought and Detroit revolutionary movement, James and Grace Lee Boggs. You talk about how they identified in the late 60s in particular, cities like Detroit, DC, Oakland, Gary, playing off of George Clinton's famous music, Chocolate City, with the idea to be a promise of black political power. And they weren't alone. I was also, when I was reading your book, reminded of somebody I read a lot when I was young, George Jackson, Black Panther Party, it was under my eye. He called the city's liberated territories. You talk about, given the neoliberal term, they're not. And so I want to start the conversation probably where we're ended, which is, what are some preliminary comments about what it would take to sort of fulfill the vision of people like Grace Lee Boggs, James Boggs, George Jackson, tens and hundreds of thousands of people who were struggling for justice in urban black and other communities?
That's a great question. So in the mid-60s, James and Grace Boggs write a piece called The City's the Black Man's Land. It's actually presented, although it's kind of about Detroit and other places like it, and James and Grace Boggs make their home in Detroit. They deliver it, and they deliver the paper first at Morgan State University, about 2 miles from where I work now at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And what they argue is that as a result of kind of shifts in the economy, cities like places like Baltimore, like Detroit, like Cleveland and others will become majority black. And not only will they become majority black, but as firms like GM and Ford in Detroit, as they become more and more automated, they'll become a larger kind of poor population that's no longer connected to the economy as such. So what they make a claim for is that once the city becomes the black man's land, and given the time, you can understand why they say black man's, even though it's not necessarily right. Once that happens, these spaces will become the site for this new movement where black people, once they take control of the city, they'll be able to kind of reimagine it, and they'll generate a series of rich alternatives. And there's actually this brief moment where it does happen, where not only do you see black people elected to office, you see black mayors elected to Gary, to Cleveland, to Atlanta, to Detroit, etc. In a number of places, including Detroit, you actually have people proposing radical alternatives, different ways to orient the economy. In Detroit's case, 2 or 3 city council persons stand out, but that moment closes shut, to the point where not that long after, when we see the neoliberal turn, first we actually see it kind of the punitive end rolled out in cities like Detroit, right? So, and now, you know, the poster child for me, the two poster childs up until very recently for kind of the worst aspects of neoliberalism that's applied to cities used to be Detroit and New Orleans. Now we can add Flint to the list, right? What's the possibilities now? So I used to argue that to the extent we'd see different possibilities for what neoliberalism, for alternatives in chocolate cities, we first have to look to Detroit, right? And that's, to a certain extent, me being romantic. You know, I try to represent Detroit in everything I do, and every, you know, chance I can get, I try to represent 313. But
remember where you are, this is 312.
there you go. But I'd argue that, so what's required? So there are a few things that are required, right? So one is a set of alternative institutions that kind of promote a different set of ideas about how cities can function, about how the economies can be arranged. You need different types of institutions. And Grace and James Boggs actually created at least one in Detroit Summer. Arguably something like the BYP 100 here can function like that, even though Chicago isn't necessarily a chocolate city. You have some institutions like that in Baltimore. But the other thing you kind of need is you need a certain type of density, right? So one of the things, so you look at Detroit on a map, just the size of it. Detroit is so big that you can fit Boston, San Francisco, and Manhattan within its borders and have 39 square miles left over. Detroit's population is about 700,000 people, right? Without the density, without people kind of interacting, without a space that allows for these random kind of rich type encounters, it's very difficult to imagine and the institutions being that are developed actually being able to grow, and it's very difficult to imagine the institutions develop kind of coming up with kind of lashing themselves up to other projects that can then lead to kind of a city type takeover, right? At best, maybe what you can have, and this is what you kind of have now in a place like Detroit, is you have these large neighborhoods that are basically governed kind of sort of by the people in it, and you don't necessarily have the state all that much involved. You don't necessarily have a great deal of support by the fire department. You don't have a great deal of support by the police department. But the challenge there is that actually that does represent a kind of an alternative way to orient and structure a city. But what they're talking about is actually changing the state apparatus in that moment. And you don't have that. You can't have that without the institutions, without density. There are other factors as well, but those different institutions and that density becomes really important.
Let's continue this for a second. And now I'm not going to talk trash. One of the ways that Chicago has been a leading city is in pioneering various forms of repression and neoliberalism and neoliberal governance. So when I was off to school before I dropped out, I came back right after Fred Hampton was assassinated by the Chicago police in December of '69. And what people didn't realize is that there certainly was an attack on the Black Panther and the Black Liberation Movement's leadership. But what they really went after, it was extraordinarily hard with the free breakfast programs, the free clinics, the sort of institutional structure that people were trying to build as alternative means of service provision, alternative means of governance. So the sort of like you talk about, for example, the people's assemblies, the type of alternative non-state institutions that would provide the type of things people need to live in flourish in democratic, safe community were actually the targets of the police in Chicago, New Orleans, in New York, in Oakland, obviously, LA. So that's one thing, in terms of the actual, how do we do, it wasn't just decapitation, it was going after the institutions as well. Second thing was, you know this as well, if not better than I do, the Chicago model was, you have poor people in the inner city, right, in the central city. But Chicago also helped with other cities in the United States move away from the American model of urban settlement to Bantustans, essentially.
Yeah.
So you're moving poor black populations and Latino populations out of San Francisco, out of Oakland, out of Chicago, into suburbs that have all the urban problems of Chicago without the resources and the political type of organization that you would have in a city like Detroit, or Harlem, or Brooklyn, what have you. And then the third thing that Chicago pioneered way back in the 1920s, and I'm not proud to say, but happy to say my family was part of this, was what we used to call neo-colonial control.
Yes.
In other words, you're not talking about neoliberal ideology, you talk about neoliberal governance, but putting a black face in to do the dirty work, to run the institute, or a Latino face, or in Oakland, Asian American face, to do two things. One is to control those populations, to mobilize them.
Yes.
Second, well, three things. Second, to selectively use patronage to try to buy off parts of those populations, particularly elites. And third, to divide groups who should be allies against each other. Some type of, competition, particularly among people of color. So, even beyond density, questions of density, how do we start fighting? Because those, we moved into a new historical era, but some of those patterns are still there.
Yeah, yeah. So, one of the things we have to do, so what the Black Lives Matter, we'll be talking about them a little bit more later, I assume, but what they're doing for the first time is basically, in the modern moment, is they're calling the punitive arm of the police into question. Right? So in a place like Baltimore, I say this factoid almost every time I get a chance to speak before public, police spending rises from 145 million in 1990 to 475 million now. To give you guys a sense of a comparison, Parks and Recs, 37 million in 1990, 37 million now. Right? And this increases through black and white mayors. So it's not like the white mayor spends all the loot, but it's, we actually see the most increase under Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake, who just decided that she wasn't going to run in the wake of the Freddie Gray murder. So what they're doing is they provide that moment, right, where they're all of a sudden saying, the way police function is wrong, and they're actually increasing the scope of blackness that we fight over, right? So somebody like Freddie Gray was far from a Rosa Parks-like figure, yet and still people are like, no, this is wrong. Michael Brown, not a Rosa Parks-like figure. Eric Garner, not a Rosa Parks-like figure, right? So what they're doing is they're kind of making a cut, saying, we need to reorient the way we think about police because it has a significant and deeply problematic effect on black populations in general. But what has to happen next, and then I'll bring in the kind of black political angle. What it ends up having to happen next is they have to kind of move towards taking on the more kind of systemic economic violence that causes slow death in these communities, right? And then in so doing that, what people have to do, what has to happen is they have to kind of recapture the idea of black working class interests, right? Because one of the reasons why black political officials in places like Baltimore, in Detroit, in Gary, in Chicago are able to kind of pull that move and articulate a black interest when it's really a black middle class, black middle to upper income interest. The reason they're able to make that move is because this concept of selling out ends up becoming kind of dominant over the concept of interest, right? So as long as somebody's able to kind of perform blackness in a certain way, it enables them to kind of make certain types of policy moves that support the type of policies that cause people to die slow deaths, right? If we kind of recapture the concept of working class interests, right, separate and distinct from how black people perform, we can then create the space where we could say somebody like, and I'm just mentioning the name, nice guy, you know, I know him, knew his former wife, like a Will Burns, right? Somebody like a Will Burns, we can say, you know what, yeah, you're my man, but no, we don't really want those policies you're proposing, right? Stephanie Rawlings Blake in Baltimore, she can hustle her butt off. I mean, literally, like the electric slide thing, she's really good at that. Oh, her electric slide game is, as the kids say, on fleek. Is that what the kids say? Did I use it right?
It's lit.
It's lit.
It's now lit.
Oh, that replaced fleek.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't keep up anymore.
Yeah, I can't. I'm still using dope. I'm still using dope.
As you should.
Well, what we can do, what that does is what that language does, that language of interest, right, kind of reroutes politics in stuff that we can get, in stuff that we should be fighting for. And then it allows us to kind of dodge that whole conversation about who's black and who isn't. And that's the conversation that once we get stuck in, it enables the type of brokerage move, the types of neocolonial moves that we've been facing since the 20s.
One of the things that we discussed, we shouldn't say how many years ago, since you were an undergraduate and I was a assistant professor, right? A while ago, let's put it that way. Was the role of black feminism in black politics. And one of the different aspects of black youth leadership today is that many BYP 100 and many other organizations insisting on a black queer feminist perspective as being central and a working class. So we're not just talking about, you know, the rich black men get what they want.
That's right.
And we're all human beings. You don't have to be respectable to be valued.
Yes.
And that there is, in fact, value in deviancy of various forms. You use Cohen's language. Should that rethink also how we think about some of the movements today? I was at a conference on global racism last week at Northwestern, and a black feminist from Rutgers, Shatima Sekra, was talking about masculinity and the politics of necropolitics. And she was saying that it's important to challenge the unjust murder of black people, particularly by the state. But by focusing on deaths in particular, we're missing one of the most prevalent forms of violence in black communities, violence against women. And should we, even when we think about our protests and our language we use, should we be much more, in this generation, more conscious of gender, sexuality, and other issues that weren't debated in the Black Power movement in the 70s?
Yes. The answer is yes.
Yes, but it's complicated.
But yes, but. So here's the thing. So I want to, juxtaposing that spectacular, the signal challenge Black Lives Matter faces, how to segue from organizing around spectacular examples of black death that tend to be, but aren't solely black male, to, again, more systemic issues of economic violence, right? And in communities like Sandtown, Winchester, where Freddie Gray was raised and murdered, the primary victims of those communities are black women and black children, because most of the black men there are in the joint. Sandtown, Winchester sends more of its population to jail than any other neighborhood in the state of Maryland. They spend $17 million a year incarcerating residents, right? So now on the one hand, you can see the spectacular thing. I mean, we've all got basically HD cameras, right? It's easy to kind of organize around that, but it's hard to, it's easy to generate affect around that. But the much harder thing is trying to figure out how to create these institutions that consistently deal with that issue, with economic violence as opposed to structural violence, economic violence as opposed to spectacular violence. To a certain extent, that dynamic deals with the gendered effects with the gendered types of violence that black communities face. As far as the leadership question, I'll take this a different way. While on the one hand, I think it's incredibly powerful that we've got sisters, we've got brothers, we've got folks who perform their masculinity, their what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman very, very differently, actually exerting voice and exerting leadership and taking leadership roles. And I talked about this today at Northwestern. There's a risk there that we end up replacing one set of charismatic elite speakers with another. And for me, although if I had a choice just between kind of different types of elite charismatic black leaders, I would kind of want elite charismatic black leaders who are trans, who are women, et cetera, than ones who are just dudes or who are rich. I really don't want charismatic black speakers. That's not the politics we should be fighting for. So the question is how do we think institutionally? So you take a figure like Ella Baker, who actually could, her talking game was dope. Like, people don't know this. Ella Baker actually had the capacity to command the stage. She did. But she knew that that wasn't the best way to empower people. So what she focused on were developing institutional mechanisms within SCLC, the NAACP, within SNCC, to make sure that the capacity to exert political speech was broad rather than narrow, right? Now, if we think about those type of moves, we can think about a much richer form of democracy than a form of democracy that just swaps out leaders. You know, well, this set of leaders happens to be queer. And again, I'd rather have queer leaders than not, but what we want is something much broader than a movement that swaps out speakers. Speech shouldn't be the focus of our politics. Institutions should be. Institutional development should be.
So I would almost certainly agree with you, but I want to pretend I don't agree with you so I can talk about the mayor's race in Baltimore. There's a young person who says he's representing various black youth political movements. Ray McKesson, how do you pronounce his name?
Yes.
And what I find appalling is that he's already being raised up by some progressive groups I'm in contact with as the new young savior for black people. These are people outside the black community. Is it as bad as it looks from outside?
I'm actually moderating one of the mayor's forums. I was supposed to be moderating a forum tonight, but I knew I'd be here. First of all, DeRay doesn't have a chance of winning. And it's not just DeRay. The mayor, so before the incumbent, before the current mayor was in office, there was a woman named Sheila Dixon who was in office. And she was removed from office for corruption. And many people felt that, with the exception of the corruption, that she really cared a lot about black neighborhoods and she was a good mayor. She's in the lead now, and from the numbers I've seen, I don't think that her leads are going to go away. The population that tends to support her is black, female, middle income, and they're going to turn out to vote. And I don't think anybody else has a shot. To the extent that we can make an intervention in Baltimore now, I think the best way is to kind of make a set of an ideational intervention. That is to inject a number of ideas in there where if Sheila wins, she'll have to draw on some of these ideas and govern. So it has to be. So I'll put that out there. So underrated. So I know black people in Baltimore who love DeRay and who support him. DeRay now lives in Baltimore, but to the extent that he's done activist work, he's really done most of his activist work outside of Baltimore. When is this going to air?
Yeah, you have that forum.
When is this going to air? Tracy, where are you? I saw Tracy in here. Where's she? Tracy.
In a few days.
In a few days. All right, you know what?
Whatever.
Y'all know me. So I had an encounter with DeRay. And in the book and in general, I make a stark distinction between organizing and activism. Right? I make a real stark distinction between organizing and activism. I believe that there are a number of people do activist work, but organizing for me is about doing deep institutional work, again, building people's capacity to organize and speak on their own behalf. Right? I believe that at best what we can think of DeRay as is an activist. DeRay isn't an organizer. In fact, in public statements on Twitter, but I think Twitter counts, he's actually indicated a disdain for organizing and for organizing work. Although we can argue that there's a lot about traditional politics that we can find distasteful, that I think when people say traditional politics, the image they have in their head is negative, right? We tend to think of corruption, a whole set of negative things. There's a whole set of things that are connected, wrapped up in traditional politics, whether it's consensus building, whether it's learning how to consistently work with people who disagree with you. There's a whole lot of stuff in there that actually does work, right? That actually means something, right? So to the extent when you have somebody like a McKesson, and to be fair, you can actually argue that McKesson is simply a 2015 version of what Jesse Jackson did in 1984. When you have somebody like him basically say, with no organizing work in Baltimore, no organizing work in general, that he has the capacity to run a municipality with a budget of over $1 billion, he's kind of disrespecting labor of black people, right? He's kind of disrespecting working class black labor, right? And I think what he represents is kind of the Twitter version of this speaking truth to power, charismatic leader thing that there are people in here who've known me since I didn't have facial hair, since I was a kid, and y'all know what I'd say if I weren't on tape.
Okay, I'm going to keep pushing in that direction, so I didn't do that. In the book, Professor Spence talks about the connections of McKesson to TFA, Teach for America. Professor Spence, from what I remember, was not amused by that connection, thought it might be debilitating for black politics, and that in fact represented a sterling example of the neoliberal turn in black politics. Did I misread that?
No, you didn't misread that at all. You didn't misread. Okay, so this is the encounter. All right, so this is the encounter. So I'm talking with one of DeRay's people, and again, Baltimore is really small. We all know each other, and the people who are working with DeRay that I know, I love them, good people. And in the course of arguing with somebody I care about who's one of DeRay's people on Facebook, she actually links me to DeRay's feed, and I didn't know I was on DeRay's feed, right? I didn't. Now the thing is I'm an adult enough and mature enough to actually be respectful, anyway. Yeah. But DeRay actually, when I made my critique, DeRay actually kind of pushes back, and he was like, "Wow, I think it's interesting that some of the people who argue for an inclusive definition of blackness, who argue for more than one way to be black, argue against the idea that there's more than one way to organize." Now that in a nutshell, besides the neoliberal stuff, which I can get to, that in a nutshell kind of articulates the challenge that we face. Yeah. So blackness, I'm looking in this room. There are as many different shades of blackness as there are people who identify being black. And all those shades are beautiful. All y'all are beautiful. There is no better way to be black, right? I'll put my social science hat on and say, on the other hand, that as many different ways of organizing, we can operationalize organizing in such a way as to determine which forms of organizing have the best capacity to increase people's capacity to govern, right? And working on Twitter, not organizing in a single organization anywhere you are, focusing primarily on media statements and TFA style expertise building doesn't lead to capacity, it doesn't lead to an increase in political capacity in any space with black people that I'm aware of. So the very idea that you compare modes of blackness to modes of organizing suggests to me that the last thing you should be doing is running for office. But to be fair,
No.
But to be fair, again, it's important to know that this isn't just a DeRay thing,
No.
right? Because the person who's supporting him loves him, right? And she's like, wow, if you just get a chance to know him. I'm like, no, this isn't about getting a chance to know. That's that whole like thing. Like I love Obama. I love being able to look at the TV screen and see Obama and his wife, and somebody's like, hey, Michelle, and she's like, hey, I love that. He has been horrible as far as reproducing a neoliberal turn. I can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Come on.
Right? That's what it's like. So it's not just about him, it's about the tendency that he represents. Wes Moore, real good brother, he didn't run for mayor, but he thought about it. Right? Again, the idea that running for mayor is something that you can do without any organizing experience. Right?
So let's talk about somebody who had a little bit of organizing experience. Chokwe Lumumba. Yeah, one of the things you talk about in your conclusion quite a bit is the organizational challenges and vision of the whole effort in Jackson, Mississippi. So maybe compare the two, and particularly what's the strengths and weaknesses of what you saw in Jackson.
Yeah, so in Jackson, what we have a political, a black radical running for mayor. He had already been a city council member from Detroit, by the way. By the way, just saying. What?
Detroit.
That's my sister. The difference is that unlike DeRay McKesson and other similar examples, rather than making a decision to run for office outside of an organizational framework, Lumumba ran for office as part of an organization. Malcolm X grassroots movement that has kind of like chapters all over the country. They have a deep chapter in Jackson.
Been there a long time.
Yeah, it's been there a long time. And they have an apparatus that has transparency. It's kind of membership based, so they actually have people actually try deep democracy. And it wasn't just about electing him. It was about promoting an entire suite of policies designed to reorient the economy. And there were deep mechanisms whereby whereby Lumumba was kind of held accountable to the organization he was a part of, right? So when DeRay and others like them, when they kind of eschew organizational work, when it's all about them, there's no way in hell that they can generate anything, winning or losing, that actually has the potential to kind of do anything other than trickle down. So maybe you'll get trickle down stuff, but you're not going to get something rich. Now the challenge with the Jackson case is still tied up in the individual. So when Chokwe dies, Lumumba dies like maybe 2-3, like as soon as he gets elected, he dies.
Yeah, like 6 to 9 months.
Right? I mean, as soon as he gets elected, he dies. If the world were if the organization really had teeth, or it was really, if it had the power, if it had more than power than what it had, then his son, who ended up running in the runoff, his son would end up replacing him. But his son didn't win in the runoff. So there's still something to be said about kind of an institution that's not as connected to individuals. But that model is so much better than that individual, Beyonce follows me on Twitter model of politics that is like comparing night to day.
Can you say a little bit more about their vision in terms of democratic institutions they were trying to build in Jackson, as well as their economic vision for the future?
Yeah, so what they wanted to do was, so they understood, so a city like Jackson, just like Chicago, just like Baltimore, controls millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars in contracts, right? So what they wanted to do was kind of develop a new economic framework to kind of deal with as many of those contracts as possible, kind of creating a shared economy, focusing primarily on co-ops, right? Kind of like this is a co-op, right? So that takes care of the economic, well, it doesn't take care of, but you can imagine how if that dynamic is implemented perfectly in a city like Jackson, it does a lot of the work that black conservative economic nationalists used to argue for, like in the 60s and 70s, right? Where money recirculates, where black communities end up being much better off. But in this case, it's not because you have an increase in the number of individual black business owners. It's because the businesses themselves are cooperatively owned, right? The other thing they had was a People's Assembly, which actually was, it was kind of an alternative governing apparatus where you actually had people kind of running at like the neighborhood level, holding office, and then able to kind of consistently be held accountable and then keep other people accountable, right? So you have like an alternative economic framework, you had an alternative political framework, right? And I think that to the extent, kind of going back to your first question about places like Detroit, the question is how can, to what extent can places like Detroit or places like Baltimore build that type of thing, right? Like what do we need to build that type of thing?
Comment and two more questions I'm going to open up to the audience. One comment is I've been working with professors and activists and organizers, much more of an organizer than an activist, to use your vernacular, Phil Thompson at MIT. Yeah. One of the things he talked about is in terms of trying to build a shared economy in black and Latino communities is take a union like the SEIU. It's not, we met with some people that I work with about months ago. Membership in the hundreds of thousands. At this point, there are over half people of color. The leadership is increasingly influenced by people of color with progressive politics. They control billions of dollars in pension funds. Those pension funds can be used to reinvest in a sustainable economy, greening the city, turning energy back to the grid, the type of urban farms and other alternatives that you were discussing in the book. So I have two questions. You can take them. I'm going to give you both at one time, and then you can put them together, and we'll move on to asking questions about it. So the technical question is, the one thing I thought that we all need to work on, all of us who are doing research on neoliberalism, is the effect of financialization on poor people's communities, black communities. There's two Canadian economists, Panish and Jinden, who talk about one part of the move to depoliticize working people in the United States was to get rid of pensions and have people have IRAs and homeowners. And and then that becomes part of those become instruments in the financial markets, right? And so people who really have no other interest in the system, what little wealth they have, what little future they have, is now tied to financial markets. And what the point they made I thought was interesting for black community, you're very hard on the Clinton administration, I think, and justifiably. And one thing they said about the Clinton administration was they enabled the predatory loans as a way to get black homeowners into the housing markets for the first time in the 90s through predatory, discriminatory loan basis, so that now black workers and black middle class have the same type of vulnerabilities and dependence on financial markets that as their white and other ethnicities equivalents. So how should we think about the whole process of financialization is dependent on financial markets and counteracting that? The other question, which is more of an organizing movement question. A lot of the young people in my generation are from, have jobs or, the workers, some of them a lot of them are young, some are students, but some is campus-based too. And one of the things that was talked about in Northwestern was parallels between the Roads Must Fall movement in South Africa and the sort of movement on campuses here to get Woodrow Wilson's name removed from institutions like Princeton. So one, in the 21st century, what value, if any, do you see between some of the Africans at the conference thought there need to be more of an internationalization of the fighting against global racism? So to what degree do you see benefit or dangers in a more Pan-African perspective, to use an old phrase, in student or other black movements in the United States? And two, in terms of specifically movements like Roseman's Fall, great colonial leader that tried to extend the British Empire and its civilization quite consciously throughout the African continent, or someone like the racist President Woodrow Wilson. Is that symbolic? Is that distraction, or is that something that's part of the struggle against various types of violence, economic, ideological, etc.?
Yeah, those are really good questions. They're kind of really, really hardly productive questions. I'll take the last one first. I think, so if you were to look at the suite, there's a website, I forgot what it is, but there's a website that basically has almost every university that has black students kind of organizing against racism on campus, the list of their demands, right? Just all of them. So you can go there, you can find, maybe you can find Johns Hopkins demands, you can find UNC Chapel Hill's demands, you can find Yale's demands, whatever. You can find all the demands. If you look at the demands, what you see is there's actually variance. That is, they're asking for different things. And you can find that some schools, that some student body, some students are pretty radical. They're pretty interested not just in kind of bringing in more black folk into the academy, more black professors or whatever. They're interested in paying a living wage. They're interested in reducing, in increasing the number of low-income housing for students who don't have a lot of loot. They're interested in increasing financial aid, et cetera, et cetera. I think, while I think that we can easily say that the Chapel Hill, for example, that the UNC Chapel Hill list of demands are really radical and something that everybody can should move towards, and they're far better for a broader swath of the black population than those that just focus on increasing the number of people like me that teach them. I am very liberal when it comes to kind of students and their organizing, right? Because this is like the first time in a long time that we see students everywhere organizing. Right? And I work on this. I am not expecting everybody to come into this at the same level, right?
We did it in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah. So I do think there's a danger in solely focusing on the symbolic stuff, right? And I would actually include I would say changing the names of buildings, buildings named by racists or named after racists. Changing those names. I would actually include those. I would include those sets of policies with increasing the number of black faculty, right? I would, or adding diversity classes or something like that. I'd include all those things are symbolic to me, right? Yeah, even though I benefit, right? I think those are things.
Can I just push back for a second? Not for hiring more people like you or me. There's not enough, but that's not high priority. One way where, I was at UVA, University of Virginia, one way they were using some of the challenging of the names was to educate about the university's complicity in the oppression of black people over time, and that seems different to me in some ways.
Yeah. I mean,
and connecting that to other types of demands.
Yes.
We're more economic in nature, more broad.
Yeah. I mean, so this is the good, and this gets back to it, right? So yes, I can say that there's some policy, there's some list of demands that are really broad, really deep, and really dope, right? But the thing is I work on the assumption that these kids are kids, and that anything that gets them working, that gets them thinking about organizing against their university is a good thing. The question is how do we keep them from staying there? To the extent that people are arguing, just making purely symbolic claims. How do we keep them from staying there? in the instances where those symbolic claims aren't tied to other political projects? How do we keep them from staying? And how do we keep them from staying there? Because I believe democracy is important. How do we keep them from staying there without ourselves using power on them? Right? Without me, for example, telling my Hopkins kids, well, if you do it like this, like we did it in Michigan, then. You know what I mean? Because what we want to do is give them the ability to kind of figure stuff out by themselves, right? Or not by themselves, but on their own. Because again, that increases their capacity to do work.
Yeah, one person who did that really well in the Black student union that I belong to was St. Clair Drake.
Oh, wow.
He was brought in to put down our movement, and you said you got me confused with somebody else. And he started talking about, this is how we organized at Hampton, not in the 1919s. This is how we organized the Merchant Marines.
Yes.
This is what I was doing when I was hanging out getting high with Canmore and Nkrumah in Accra. So it was like a lot of information. But he doesn't make our own mistakes.
Yes.
He didn't say, this is what you should, therefore this is what you should do.
Right.
That was never said.
Oh, I got you. So now going backwards, one of the challenges, not just with organizing with folks in other places in the world, but organizing even with other campuses up and down the Eastern Seaboard, in my case, is that I really believe that it's really hard for people to kind of, when you're thinking about organizing, like when I think about organizing, me as a mid-40s, as a middle-aged adult, I can think about taking Baltimore. That is, I can wrap my head around taking the city. Once I step up from that scale to taking Maryland, it gets harder. Once I step up from that scale to taking the country, it gets even harder than that, right? There's something to be said about starting local, doing deep local work, and then lashing up alongside other organizations doing work elsewhere, as opposed to kind of early lashing up, and then you just lose the scale. You stay at the theoretical, right? Because nobody, I guess it's possible to think really deeply and legitimately about taking the state of Illinois, but I'm willing to bet that most people don't really have the capacity to really think about, much less perform the type of labor that would have to occur to actually do that. Whereas again, taking Chicago is bigger than Baltimore, but taking a neighborhood in Chicago, then growing from that, that's something everybody can wrap their head around. And particularly given that we're building political capacity. This isn't 1968 compared to 1955, where you got like a good 15 plus years of people organizing. We're maybe in if you look at something like Occupy Wall Street as being a part of it, we're maybe year 5 of a longer project. Maybe, right? So we start small and build out. So that's the challenge, right? The opportunity is easy to think through, but that's the challenge. Securitization, the last thing, financialization. One of the things one of the moves that, speaking of Occupy Wall Street, one of the things that Occupy Baltimore did, they didn't stay there, but they started briefly fighting against foreclosures, right? They would actually, you talk about direct action, they would prevent, I believe they successfully prevented a few folks from getting foreclosed. They just kind of built a wall of bodies around, right? And one of the things we haven't talked about is the neoliberalization of the black church.
Yeah.
You can easily imagine how something like that, which fights against financialization, can actually be attached to a black institution in ways to kind of radicalize it, in ways to kind of bring a certain type of morality and spirituality to bear. Thinking about other ways to tackle that issue, I think fighting for policies that peel off a portion of city budgets in order to kind of deal with the effects of financialization. That's something that maybe doesn't win at the outset, but you can use that to build intelligence and build support for a wider radical political project. But with something like that, because the financialization issue is so complex, it's like we have to really, in those issues, with that type of issue, we have to start not just local, but we have to start kind of reorienting people and teaching people about the economy, how it works, how we end up changing from a place in which most of our GDP is generated from producing things to a dynamic where most of our GDP is generated by like stuff that we can't, by ideas.
One thing some people talk about, how do we democratize financial governance? And one thing that people have been doing for a number of years, including now, is boycott and divestment, right?
Yes.
But what we have done less is talk about not just boycott, but directing where funds that are supposed to be are being invested in our name, where those funds actually do get invested, not just where they shouldn't be invested.
Yeah.
And that's part of the democratization problem. We'll take questions at this point.
Okay. So you talk about getting students from that place of, Twitter and social media activism to organization, but how would you suggest that me as a young black queer woman who's a part of BSUs and BSAs and, writes these poems and performs them and who works, with youth and make sure that you talk about social issues, how do you move from this, what I feel is all of these different kinds of symbolic activism organizing, how do you move from that to actual organization? Like, how do you take that next step without, I don't know, just how do you get there?
So one of the things that Dasha's been really effective at doing in Milwaukee is building, I'm sorry, she's from Milwaukee, Dasha Kelly. Dasha, could you do me a favor? So she's technically not the poet laureate of Milwaukee, but she was runner-up. So I'm going to kind of call her my poet laureate.
Of the state, but that's okay.
So what she and others in Milwaukee, what people like Jessica Caramore in Detroit have created in these cities are these cultural spaces where black people can express themselves through a variety of different means, poetry being first and foremost, right? And although not all of those folks are performing poetry that we can deem as being political, just like not all MCs performing political rap, a number of them are performing, that space allows for a certain type of discussion about political issues. So if you're not talking about students, for example, that are already at a space, that are already kind of like at a college of some sort, like one thing you can do is take those spaces that you're already using for cultural work and then kind of tilt it a little bit to the left, right? Mm-hmm. Right, where you're actually creating a space for either people to perform poetry that deals with some of the political issues, or you're creating the space for people to kind of come together to talk about those issues as students. Now the thing is we've been talking about students, but one of the challenges I think we have to face is that this isn't just a student thing, right? And it's not just students that have problems organizing. It's not just students that we should be mobilizing to organize. So one of the most important people in Baltimore, as far as organizing, is a retiree. Her name is Kim Trueheart. Kim Trueheart knows, so most of Baltimore's economic decisions are made in a body called the Board of Estimates. And the Board of Estimates is a really arcane body, and the stuff they talk about is so arcane that the people who are on the Board of Estimates don't necessarily know what they're talking about. But Kim Trueheart, because she's retired, she knows that Board of Estimates stuff backwards and forwards, right? So she knew, for example, that there was a move afoot to privatize the water in Baltimore way before most of the rest of us did. Imagine if the retirees were mobilized, right? Imagine if black retirees were mobilized, right? I talk about the moral thing, and I really don't believe that we should be thinking about this as a moral project, this is a political project, and an interest-based project. But to the extent we can deploy morality, imagine the power we could deploy if we had a group of retirees saying, "No, baby, you know what, no, what y'all doing is wrong. You know you wrong. You know you wrong. Baby, you know you wrong." You know, I mean, that type of, right? That type of thing. So with this example of students, with the specific example you gave me, it's about kind of repurposing the cultural spaces that already exist to get people talking about politics and then gradually to get people doing political work. But it's not just those those cultural spaces for the students. It's also retiree homes, right? It's also neighborhood centers, right? It's libraries. There's a whole set of spaces that can be repurposed and should be repurposed along the same way.
Just two examples. One is Chicano theater movement, the theatrical movement back in the 70s. You know, often they started as students at a college like San Francisco State, but then they brought in people from the community, they took it other places, and they started talking about the type of problems that were affecting them as members of the community. The same thing in Occupy Rome with a bunch of theater people, and they brought in, they started voting on like water orders, you know, when you like the type of utility policies, because they were going to shut down the theater. They said, no, you're not. You know, they turned those spaces that were cultural spaces, they became cultural spaces. They remain cultural spaces. They also became places for people's assemblies, although, you know, people have different terminology for it.
You know, brother in the back, let's see.
I also have a question about, I guess, politicizing. So to your concern about sort of only mobilizing students, social media seems to have become a great platform for politicizing wide groups of people and teaching them more about politics. However, it's also become a sort of vehicle through which there's a sort of production of a social capital that people accumulate as a result of being activists and being organizers or performing their politics online. They can accumulate it so much so that they enter a mayoral race in a major city and hope to win. So I'm wondering how we can sort of, engage that tension between social media as a space where people become famous and people sort of perform themselves or perform politics in a non-substantive way, and then social media as a space where people can teach each other, can communicate with each other across borders around the world and that sort of thing, and really politicize one another. So is social media like, is it completely hopeless? Should we move away from it toward a sort of in-community conversation, or can we reclaim it in a way such that we sort of militate against the production of that social capital that I find pretty dangerous?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Institutions. I think social media isn't going anywhere, and it can be a very powerful engine for kind of bringing people together, mobilizing people immediately. I think the challenge is just how do we create institutions whereby you have a couple of different dynamics. One is you kind of spread the idea that social media is this other thing, right, that can be used as opposed to something that generates its capital itself. And then then when you do have people blow up, generating 300, 450, 500,000 followers, people kind of have a sense that people kind of automatically call their legitimacy into question, right? So in the case, and again, DeRay McKesson is just the example, but we could use a wide range of other examples. I think it's important to note that DeRay McKesson actually isn't viewed as legitimate in Baltimore, right? Because Baltimore already has kind of the institutional apparatus to determine who's legitimate and who isn't. Now, that move itself is problematic. That move is deeply imperfect. But, you talk to anybody who actually does either organizing or activist work in Baltimore, and very, very few of them actually view DeRay McKesson as legitimate. And what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you guys, I'm going to take questions in blocks and then tackle them in blocks, right? Because otherwise we'll be here. So 1, 2, 3. Your sister, yeah.
So thanks for coming out here. I have a question kind of on the same vein as what we've been talking about. We're talking about mobilizing retirees, mobilizing students. I have a question on the regular person who's just going about his or her day and who because of cultural influences, may just be imbibing neoliberalism as, what's wrong with that? So I'm thinking of Beyonce and Formation.
Yeah.
Loved the video, gave me life, but at the end,
Those words.
I always say gracious, best revenge is your paper. What is that? So
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of ask about how we actually communicate to people who aren't in spaces that are, I guess, necessarily politically charged, what it is that they're actually imbibing and what it is that it means for them in terms of real policy ramifications in their lives. I can't listen to information without thinking of that when I talk to my really good friend, like, ugh, she's getting into some really neoliberal, capitalist, funky stuff at the end. It's just music. So that's the conversation. That's the issue that I feel a lot of people did that.
Yeah. Okay. That's a question.
So as we know, the Black Panther Party wasn't just a social movement, they were political. A lot of them were Maoists or communists. What do you think about the return of mass line organizing as a part of our current liberation movement?
The return of what?
Mass line movement? Mass line organizing?
I think for me, it's similar to the sister's question there, right? But I think we just wanted to, language, right? And then let's say in our community, the word hustle has an endearing an effect, right? Like it's something that we wear as a badge of honor if you're a hustler, if you have a hustling spirit. What language for the average person? I do a lot of political literacy, grassroots organizing type work. So for that person who's takes pride in that hustling spirit and who's how do you disjoint them from that and the way that we've been programmed to revere that charismatic leader and how we wrap our energy and our intentions around that one's organizing. That's I got it from my mama and her mama as a form of organizing.
Yeah.
But what language do you use? And it could very well be in the book. But what language do you suggest to be able to help disjoint that person emotionally from our relationship to the word hustle and our allegiance to the charismatic organizer?
Yeah.
Or activists.
Those are good questions. What's mass line? You're actually educating me. What's mass line?
I'm sorry. It was the strategy used by all communist revolutions. It depended on time, place, and condition, and worked with that and worked on people on a personal level.
Oh.
Like going into communities first, not taking political.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I get it now.
It's a type of organizing Kelly talks about in the Souls article.
Yeah.
About models in the Black community.
Yeah. Is that the type of stuff that SNCC used to do, kind of, sort of?
Some did, yeah, but the
Yeah,
Black
some did.
Panther Party, Baraka stuff that I used to do.
Yeah.
It was more along those lines.
So they're all of a piece. How do we? That's a really tough question, and this is where.
I think first one, they tell me wrong, come over.
You probably won't be wrong, but you can talk.
Well, the language one, I think both the Black Panther Party and I think the real genius of Malcolm X is the ability to take complicated ideals and communicate them without talking down to people in the language of the people. And that's something we can emulate from the organizing and revolutionary movements in Black communities. And the best organization should be able to do that on a consistent basis. Which also comes back to what I've both written about this and based on some of my own experience. And so is Robin Kelly and some other Black scholars. I think the real danger with whether we're talking about the 20s and 30s and organizing in the Black Liberation Movement, the Communist Party, or the Maoist turn with the Black Panther Party, Congress of African Peoples, Detroit Revolutionary Union Movement, and Black Workers Party, and all the organizations that followed well into the 70s, was two things. One is increasingly divorcing themselves from the grassroots organizations and movements that they came out of, whether it was the August 29th movement, the Chicano movement, or Young Lords Party out the Puerto Rican movement, but moving away from that was one of the tendencies we saw in mass line organizing. And the second one was de-emphasizing. There was strong emphasis, at least initially, never on organizing around patriarchy. That was not part of it. but organizing around both racial oppression and around class oppression was strong, but those organizations started moving away from organizing around race. So that was another weakness. But a massive weakness, at least in my viewpoint, was taking models from China, Tanzania, Russia, where the conditions did not meet. Did not at all mirror Guinea-Bissau, pick a revolutionary country, and they tried to apply them in the United States without thinking about, actually, what does the economy of the U.S. look like today in 1973? So I think I would rather see us think about what our conditions are and then develop a strategy and a language for struggle here, coming out of the conditions here.
And this goes back, so going back to the spaces that you guys have in Milwaukee and the spaces that exist in Detroit, those cultural spaces are places where you can actually you can generate a counter narrative that's kind of wrapped in the stuff that people are already consuming, that kind of deconstructs what that hustler is, that can deconstructs what the effect of that type of language on us, right? We already have the spaces where we're doing it, and there are a number of kids and a number of adults who are already making those types of interventions. So it's about figuring out how to take the cultural stuff that's already there and then kind of repurposing it. Because I think that's the way you do it. It's not just about critiquing, it's about proposing alternatives, right? In this case, it's about kind of generating a different set of cultural ideas that at least call these figures, call the hustlers into question, or even call somebody like Beyonce into question, right? But in a way that doesn't make the people who are consuming it thinking that they're necessarily stupid because they used to agree with this other thing.
One thing I think every movement learns, particularly the students and the faculty of those movements, is they have much more to learn than they have to teach. I remember going through study group after study group trying to read Capital. And when my wife was thrown out of work and I dropped out, thrown out of school and I was dropped out of school, and we had to actually earn a living to feed our children. Being in a study group, the workers in a study group understood surplus value far better than any academic I've ever met. So a lot of the analysis already exists. And part of what we have to do is bring it out to the fore, make it public, and learn from it.
Paul Ainsley, then Paul.
Let me do the simple question first. Simple for you all. What is neoliberalism?
Thank you. Ainsley.
So I was gonna I'm kind of pessimistic. So I'm all about democracy, right? And I feel like that's all we have, right? But I'm really pessimistic about the Democratic project right now because of what we're seeing happen with the rise of Trump, right? And it's not just because there's a Trump, there's always, whatever. But like the sort of neoliberal, sort of like hustling kind of politics that you're pointing out is like the turn that black politics has made seems to me to also map on to mainstream politics, period, right? To be a part of mainstream politics and to sort of make that leap is to be involved in a kind of hustling kind of, corral the masses, and then you speak, you represent a particular viewpoint, which then makes me think about like the white mob that you see sort of like rising up. And so like even like listening to all like the things that you have to say about what's required for black politics and black organizing, I'm thinking about, well, that's what the nation needs right now, because it's like this sort of like white mass voice that is rising up really does, I think, speak to the anti-democratic, sort of model of politics that is proliferating in this nation, period. Like, no grassroots, like whatever. So
I got you.
Speak to that.
Dr. Richie.
I did. Playing devil's advocate, how do you respond to the criticism that this conversation, this debate is really about being a gatekeeper, about making sure that the next generation does what we did? And I understand the examples you laid out, how it's not that conversation, but when knowing that the average person, this idea of not consuming what is so abundant,
when the models that are being proposed, brick by brick, community building, how successful has that been? Here's where we still are. Clearly, I need to think about me. So how do you respond to the critics of this as a school of thought?
Okay. And
I'm just curious how you navigate you in all of this. And like your experiences, your perspective, and how you fit into what you're talking about.
did you read the foreword?
I haven't yet.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not saying that in a tripping way. So in order. So neoliberalism, I define neoliberalism, or neoliberalism is basically defined in kind of 3 different ways. One is kind of as a class project designed to expropriate resources from the bottom, take it up to what we think of as the 1%. Second is the set of institutional arrangements that basically significantly remake government, that deregulate, that reduces the ability of governments to collect taxes, that deregulates a wide variety of industries, and that removes the welfare state and replaces it with a very punitive version. And then third is kind of a cultural project designed to remake people, institutions, and almost every aspect of human endeavor into something that can be kind of governed and disciplined by the market. And this is where Jay-Z's line, "I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman," comes up, right? The effects of neoliberalism, when we see them in stark, it significantly increases inequality, significantly increases the use of policing, significantly exacerbates a wide, it significantly reduces the ability of people like us to live quality lives. Ainsley question. That gets at the question of scale. When I talked about scale and say I can imagine taking Baltimore, I can imagine taking Detroit, I can't really think about Maryland. The reason I can't think about Maryland is because if you look at Maryland, and we can do this with every state, right? So y'all know that red state, blue state thing, where every election they show. It's not really a red state, blue state thing. It's a blue county, red state thing, right? The whole rest of the state, every state is red except this blue county, these blue counties. And the reason the counties are blue is because you have large proportions of working class folk, of black folk, Latino folk, right? That dynamic, I know how to deal, I can wrap my head around. I don't know how to, dealing with that Trump population, I can't, yeah, I know, but all I can do is what all I can write about, and all I can fight for is, what my local conditions are. I mean, at some point in time, we're gonna have to lash up and create kind of multiracial coalitions, and that's really, really, really important. But in conditions of hypersegregation, it's kind of hard to see, it's kind of hard to think about how that actually happens. I see you, sister. How do you respond to the gatekeeper argument? Very carefully. I don't know how to respond to that. That's a great question. I don't know how to respond to that. Where do I situate myself? So the reason I asked if he had read the foreword is because I actually unpack a series of unfortunate events that befell me, that hit me like right before I went up for tenure, and happened to me kind of right after. And I use that in order to kind of, to a certain extent, unpack the black box of what it means to be a professor living in this specific moment. Also to show how even though I have a PhD, even though I'm at one of the best schools in the world, that I've been victimized by this dynamic too. But then thirdly, as victimized as I've been by this, people who work at Walmart and at other institutions, they're even harder hit than I am, right? So that's kind of how I situate myself. As far as politically, I don't think of myself, I think one of the terms that we tend to throw around a lot is scholar activist. I don't think of myself as a scholar activist. I don't think of myself as a scholar organizer. I do believe ideas are important, and I'm hoping that by interjecting these ideas into spaces like this, we can generate kind of a conversation that kind of replaces the black people are dysfunctional, this black nihilist thing that people like Cornel West, even though he considers himself to be on the left, is responsible for. Right?
You don't think profits are better than that?
No, yeah, oh wow, oh yeah, yeah. So he asked me, do I think prophecy? So that charismatic male leadership thing, or that charismatic leadership thing, one of the things we have to really kill, dead in the sleep if we can, like put a pillow over it in the bed, right? It's this idea of speaking truth to power, this idea of prophetic utterance, right? It's deeply, 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 deeply elitist, deeply, 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 deeply anti-democratic. And it tends to end up generating a dynamic where all the affect and energy go up to this charismatic speaker, often male, as opposed to something being distributed. One of the chapters that I like the most in the book, it actually unpacks what went on in the bus boycott to talk about the important role of institutional labor, right? Deep institutional labor, as opposed to the Kingian, speaking truth to power thing.
But part of that, there's two things in that chapter. One is really re-bringing, as many, Barbara Ransky and many others have talked about, as Theodore Harris, bringing Rosa Parks' real world back into light as a talented, trained organizer who made strategic and tactical decisions. And the King's own self-criticism about needing to more deeply organize, more institutionalized, and so you brought both of those back into light in that chapter as well.
Yeah. So I gave a talk earlier today in Northwestern. Basically, the talk was about kind of Ella Baker. If the world were really, really right, what we have is an Ella Baker Day instead of a Martin Luther King Day. Even though there's no way in hell she'd want an Ella Baker Day. I mean, it's kind of what made her Ella Baker.
I want to go back to the question that you posed about Pan-African and organizing. And it kind of goes with what the sister said, mentioned about, having to deal with the larger organization of everybody, not just with blacks.
Yeah.
But back to the Pan-African, how do you organize, get groups together when Africans don't deal in that concept of color,
So she asked about how do you create kind of a new Pan-Africanist project. One thing is important to note is that there actually already exists a Pan-Africanist project. So the reason Creflo Dollar asked his church people for like a $60 million plane is so he can travel across the Atlantic, go into the Caribbean, and he can go into Africa, because we have those spaces are being neoliberalized in very similar ways as black spaces are here. That's important to kind of note. I don't talk at all about that dynamic in the book, but I think it's important to bring up. But as far as how to do that in spaces, the natural spaces to kind of begin that project is on college campuses like Chicago and Hopkins. And what a number of us have tried to do is to kind of use, to the extent we can, use our courses to get people to think about a more expansive more expansive definition of what it means to be black, right? So if you think about that black student union, Michigan had a black student union and had an African student union too. African Student Association. I don't think we had any relationship between the two, largely because the black student union wasn't really a black student union. What it was the African American student union, right? Hopkins, so Hopkins has a black student union, it has an African Student Association, and it has a Caribbean student group too, right? So the question is how do we get people, and again, this is where professors can actually do important work, how do we get people to think of blackness as this wider thing than just being an African American thing? And then once you begin that conversation, you can then lash it up to certain types of political projects that can create the type of progressive coalitions, at least on the college campus, that I think we will want.
I think part of it also is, again, partly of the discussions, the Global Racism Conference last week, is that the experience of South Africa is fairly central. You have a progressive organization, the ANC, that gains power, and 20 years later, the problems with neoliberalism and lack of democracy and what's happening to the welfare of the great majority of people. It's not questions that people are asking within South Africa and Nigeria, where you have similar type of very strong neoliberal project going on throughout the continent. So some of the problems people are making links on, and part of this is certainly one of the things we haven't talked about, the role of U.S. foreign policy, and that it's not just a question of the state becoming domestically more coercive, but more imperial as well, the use of military and intelligence operations overseas to enforce a neoliberal project where it can't be done through the political system and financial system.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
So my question is about the institution of the university as an institution, not just that produces scholars punitively, right, but that is something that is constitutive of a community, especially in a place like Hyde Park. But also, I came from Hopkins last year, and very much in Baltimore, at least that's what Hopkins very much likes to present itself as part of the community. And especially last April, I mean, it was in this very precarious situation where it wanted to be part of the community for this cultural cachet, but then also to protect its students from the things that Anderson Cooper was claiming were happening that really weren't happening in certain neighborhoods. So, I mean, these are two institutions that are highly centralized and are increasing their centralization. But then they, at the same time, they have things like the at Hopkins now is the Forum on Race, that has kind of a wide breadth of people involved, but at the same time, it's kind of anathema to a lot of the policies that the universities are pursuing. So, what can be? I mean, what is there to do
I'm on that committee.
Okay, yeah. So then, what is there to be done about the policies of the university?
What's the university's role?
I was just going to ask you to speak a little bit more about the role of the church in organizing, especially you have a section about a move from, liberation theology to prosperity theology. On one hand, that's it kind of maybe takes away a space for organizing. On the other hand, I think it makes room in our politics for something like Black Lives Matter movement, because those activists may have been sidelined in a space like the church. So maybe you could just talk about what you might see as important sites of organizing now and possibilities there.
All right, and then you had a question.
Yeah, so going off of that, what strategies would you propose for dealing with existing Black institutions that work in collusion with neoliberalism? Dealing both with what they're doing, but also the space that they're taking up.
Yes. I think you look familiar. So what he's talking about when he's talking about Hopkins, the Forum on Race. We brought up Angela Davis most recently. We brought up Charles Blow. We brought up Ta-Nehisi Coates. We brought someone else up. And there are a number of other initiatives that Hopkins made kind of in the wake of the Baltimore uprising. Some of them were not only symbolic, but you can tell kind of what the politics were. So there's a couple of magazines that actually have my face on, there's a magazine that had my face on the cover. And then there was another magazine that had me and this book prominently featured. And for real, Hopkins doesn't really love me like that, right? I mean, the kids do, but Hopkins itself doesn't really love me like that. What I see our role in institutions like Chicago and Hopkins is to kind of inject, is to create space for kind of radical ideas about how they should function. So Johns Hopkins itself actually has abolitionist politics. That's usually removed from the history of Johns Hopkins University, but Hopkins has abolitionist politics. How can we use this space to inject kind of ideas in the public that can then be used to make Hopkins do the right thing in a wide array of different areas? That's a hard thing to do because there aren't a lot of us. Not only are there not a lot of Black people, there aren't a lot of folk with progressive politics, but that's what we're trying to do. That's what we're trying to do with that forum. And then there are a number of us who are trying to work in communities in Baltimore to try to generate democratic space to try to make them act right. similar with the work that the Center's doing here at the University of Chicago, the work they've been doing with BYP 100. You know, and then you can point to Carnegie Mellon, the work Rodney Williams is doing there. So there are these pockets in these universities that make that reveal that the university is far more a contested space than perhaps you guys might think, right? So it's about keeping these, increasing the space of contestation and seeing and taking the university seriously as a site of struggle, as opposed to, for example, saying that the real site of struggle is in the community or the real site of struggle is in Baltimore, right? Taking those second two questions, those latter questions together, you have to take them over, right? What we have to do is we have to, at best, we have to be deeply involved in spaces where we can that are predominantly black and that are engaged in the neoliberalization project, whether it's the church, whether it's other institutions, and try to take them over, or at the very least, kind of critique them to the point where they're no longer rendered illegitimate, where they can no longer claim to viably speak for black populations. I think that takeover project is something that we don't. It's long work. It's really, really hard work. It's really, really hard work, and a lot of these spaces are deeply, deeply entrenched. But I think that's something that we should be taking more seriously than what we do. Had a question already, so looking forward to it. Yes, sir, you sister.
Yeah, thank you. Two things. First, I think near the end of your talk, you mentioned kind of moving more from like a goods GDP to a more ideas-based GDP, and I'm just hoping you would kind of maybe unpack that a little bit. And secondly, along with the movement seeming to center feminist voices and queer voices more, there seems to be also more of an emphasis on taking trauma seriously and talking about healing justice, not just like health activism, but actually like alternative sites of care and ideas of wellness. So I'm just kind of curious where you see those discourses about health and healing intersecting with neoliberalism, either in a positive way or in a negative, like, you know, is this just one more symptom of a more personalized, individualized notion of health? Or just where is it coming from? It seems fresh, but maybe it's old.
Yeah. So the first thing. So here's a simple way to think about it. There was a time where GM made most of its loot selling cars, right? Where Ford made most of its loot selling cars. Now the most profitable wing of GM is their loans, right? It's their financing wing. It's no longer their car wing, right? Apple makes more money selling apps than I think it does selling computers.
For a long time.
For a while, right? So that's one way to think about the move away from selling goods to kind of selling kind of ideas, right? The second thing, I can't really talk about the roots, and what I'll talk about is a critique, because I think there is a need for healing spaces. I think that's incredibly important. I think working class populations in general have been traumatized by the turn, and we're suffering in a lot of different ways that bleed out in our interactions. But the challenge on the other hand is, what I see is, I see that dynamic more often than not leading to kind of therapeutic personal interventions than it does to kind of deep political interventions.
I'll talk a little bit about the roots. I mean, I think there were certainly a number of movements in the 60s and 70s, a desire to get away from institutionalized, unhealthy medicine on one hand. And certainly, I remember in some of the black communities I worked in, it was connected in some of the Asian American communities I know about. It was very deeply connected to politics. So there were people, doctors. There were. It was both trying to. It was both. There was a linking to having more healthier eating habits, healthier styles of life, but that was connected to institutionalized politics as well. And I think with the sort of attack on all the different types of institutional forms of progressive politics, it became commodified, like almost every good idea does. And it became much more rooted in an individual. You have responsibility for your own body. If you're unhealthy, it's your fault. And these are the things you can buy, services, videos, yoga mats, what have you. You practice yoga, but I mean, it's all on you at this point, and which means that it's very much oriented toward a different class. Divorced from community, divorced from organizing, divorced from radical political institutions and radical political analysis.
Paul and
do you see a lot of the questions around organizations? Do you see, and maybe neoliberalism is maybe a good framework, but do you see like people who are organizing on the other way, like people who are trying to screw things up, or who have been organizing around policies that have resulted in sort of where we are now? And so, I don't know if the Koch brothers would be an example, but who's organizing on the other side as an example, and what do you pull away good and bad from their organization? Because I'm assuming how they're organizing will be different than what everyone in the room has been talking about for the last couple of hours.
Yeah, that's a great question. Sister, you got another question?
I was just kind of going to ask about your opinion on this new verbiage that we have, you might not be aware of, where you have the woke versus sleep debate. So from your Twitter activists, you get those people who now it's everyone wearing the hat of being pro-black because it's the in thing. So how do you set yourself apart from being the woke person and actually being conscious of your community and its issues? And
so I'll take, if I get this right, I'll take the second, and then you could talk about Chicago with Paul. So Angela Davis was the last speaker we brought in the forum for race at Hopkins, and Angela Davis talked about prison abolition, gave her a normal spiel. She was absolutely brilliant. At the end, she had a question. She got a question from the audience, from a brother, and his question was, and Tracy, you'd appreciate this. His question was, what do you say about the idea that that feminism killed the black liberation movement? And he asked that really believing. He was like, listen, I feel that black masculine, that we can no longer be men, that we can, I thought it was like, listen, it was like a U-Car, it was like a U-Car thing, right? And the audience is looking at him, and he's asking a question earnestly. And the audience is wanting Angela, the audience is like, Angela Davis is about to go in on this. Right? And they want him to. They want her to. Angela Davis is like, just waiting. And after he gets the question out, she like leans against the podium. She was like, you know what? I could talk to you for hours. She just took that, and then she basically gently led him to understanding how we don't have the civil rights movement or the black liberation movement without women organizing on their behalf and behalf of black people, right? And by the end, she had won him over. He had taken notes. He was like, wow. Because she was like, baby, you need to read this, you need to read this. Right. So I talked to her about this after. And I knew what she would say, right? Because Tracy and them brought her up to Michigan when we were kids. She was like, when I was talking to him, I was thinking like an organizer, right? Because the reality is that in the communities we're fighting for, you go to Sandtown, Winchester, where Freddie Gray was killed, you talk to them about prison abolition, they don't want prison abolition. They think maybe prisons should be more just, right? But they don't want the prisons to be abolished. Right. They don't want you to get rid of the police, they want the police to function better, right? What she enables, and a number of people do, is this sense of, they understand that consciousness comes in stages, and that it's not about creating this consciousness hierarchy, right? And I'm about to be starker than I'm making a really stark distinction again, but I think people who are really about that organizing life kind of understand that it's not about being woke versus sleep. It's about kind of loving people where they are and understanding that that in many cases they know a lot more about their life than you do, and just kind of the richness of black life in general. If we're talking about black populations, so that's how if I understand your question, your question correctly, that's how I deal with that. That's one of the hardest things to do, to tell people who are on that consciousness kick, right? Who are making real stark distinctions between people who are conscious up here and people who aren't conscious. Like, no, you got to love people, right? You got to organize. That's not what organizers do. We'll take Chicago.
Well, I would take not just Chicago.
Okay.
So, what's the right doing? And I was doing a little bit of history. So I tell people who ask me about Trump and the current period or what's the right doing, that there's 2 years we just think about. One is 1932, the other one's the 1890s. 1890s in the United States, 1932 in Germany. And why is that? It's because a wide range of middle class and working classes are suffering economic inequality, economic turbulence, have lost faith in the country, have lost faith in the direction, don't know where to go. People who are being disadvantaged by those who are on top can either come together or they can blame each other, and you end up either in the most conservative set of governments in the United States that governs, has a right-wing government in the Supreme Court and national politics for the next 50 years, and kills the populist movement off and any hope of interracial solidarity. In 1932, in the Weimar Republic, you get Nazism as the alternative. And what the right has done is several things, some of which we should emulate. It's hard to teach science in some states in the Corn Belt and in the South, because they've organized block by block. They've turned people out to take over school boards. They learn a lot of lessons from the civil rights and black power movements, and the Chicano movement and the women's movement, and then took those and kept those and just took over local government and state governments and in ways that understand if we wanted to change the curriculum, where do we invest? So that's one thing they do. Two is, and this is the Chicago example, they tell young black, ambitious, bright people, if you want to make it, you would follow us and buy into the program. This is what the benefits are. And you get a Will Burns, who first started working. He didn't start working for Obama. He started working for Obama. And he was trying to figure out he kept plotting campaigns to dislodge progressive black elected officials. First a black woman, Alice Palmer, and then not that progressive, but more progressive than Obama was at the time, Bobby Rush. We are trying to freeze out, he told me, our strategy in the Obama campaign is to freeze out the black working class and align white people with the black middle class. So that's the second thing you do. You find ambitious young people and tell them this is the way to advance your career. The third thing you do is you mobilize, and this is one thing we should not do, is, as Chris Parker and others have shown us, you organize around racial hatred, and first you get the Tea Party and use that as a blunt instrument to win electoral victories, and that leads to Donald Trump. And the fourth thing that we can't do is use billions of dollars to buy politicians, airtime, and everything else. So we have to use some of those other, it's probably healthier for us that we don't have billions of dollars to spend on airtime, but some of these other things in terms of organizing block by block and mobilizing people, we have done in the past and can do again.
You know what? So I got one question, but before I take that question, I wanted to give shout outs. There are a number of people in the audience that are really formative to my intellectual development. I won't go as far as to say that I'm here because it's you and that's your fault, but I'm here because of you and it's your fault. Starting in the back, Tracy Matthews, the organizing work she did is the reason a number of us made it into undergrad in the University of Michigan. She's the reason, she and the tendency she represented is partially responsible for me being in graduate school. I see two of my fraternity brothers, they're the reason through blood and sweat and tears that I was able to kind of continue even when, that forward is something. Even when it looked like as an adult, so Bank of America came from my house twice while I was going up for tenure. and it was in part because of the lessons I learned while pledging with Darius McKinney and Glenn Eden that I was able to kind of make it through that. Paul Stevens put me up, and when I come to Chicago a number of points in time in my career. Michael Dawson was one of my first undergraduate teachers. Yeah, it really is your fault. And then my sister is like over there in the far left. And then I see at least 3 of my undergrads from WashU who are in the room. It's really, really important. I'm really honored that you guys came out to see me. And what I try to do when I do, to the extent that my work has kind of a broader political purpose, is to do you guys justice. Is to do the work you guys put in me and that we put in to Michigan and other places like it justice.
So my overall question is your thoughts on this Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter argument, and then a more specific question would be your thoughts on how Black people require you to be an advocate for Black Lives Matter, although you should be, but at the same time there's a caste system within the Black community, and how can we reach a consensus where we're all on the same page?
That's a hard question. All these questions have been really, really hard to open. I don't know if a consensus can be reached, right? But the question is, how can you create spaces where you can kind of figure out what the answer is at any given moment in a way that kind of is viewed with legitimacy by large swaths of the Black population. As far as the Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, to me that's pretty straightforward. I think that although I do think it would be really, really, really dope to see Black folk actually organize in those instances where where the police actually kill white folk or police kill folk who aren't Black, because of hyper-segregation. I think there's a reason why that concept ends up taking hold, and that's a primary reason, although not the primary reason, why we don't see that, if not the All Lives Matter hashtag or something like it, at the very least, why we don't see Black Lives Matter folk organizing against other instances of similarly spectacular violence. Oh, one more shout out, Cedric Johnson. Cedric, thanks for coming. He's written one of the most important books on Black politics in the last 20 or 30 years or so. Definitely one of the best books that somebody of my generation has written.
And the title is?
From race leaders to revolution, from revolutionaries to race leaders. Yeah, they should actually have that.
One quick thing on the consensus is people like Ainsley keep trying to hammer into my head that democracy is contentious, and that to have a healthy democracy, we're not going to agree, and we should welcome competing viewpoints. I know that's something we sometimes, nationalists try to squash that. The Marxist groups I belong to try to squash that. We have the correct line. But if you want a really democratic movement, you have to have contention. But you also have to have respect that each of our viewpoints, and that's the other side of it, is to get rid of the hierarchy and caste part of it, is the other side of democracy is a radical egalitarianism, that all of us are valued as human beings and our ideals are also valued.
So, so I mentioned Cedric, I gave a shout out to Cedric. So a really nice, healthy example of kind of contention. You can see, now granted, the internet is the internet, but Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a piece asking why Sanders didn't support reparations. And Cedric wrote a really, really good piece in the Jacobin actually arguing against that. And then Ta-Nehisi went back. And it was contentious. It wasn't always respectable. It wasn't always respectful, for real. But it was the type of debate that we actually need to see more of. I'm not the guy to talk about Black cultural dysfunction in any area, but to the extent, the closest I'll come is that sense that we kind of need to all be on the same page. That's something that minority groups in general, I think, tend to kind of articulate. I mean, you definitely see this in the Jewish community in a number of different spaces. It's this idea that we have to kind of agree.
Malcolm X, don't wash your dirty laundry in public.
That's it. Civilized people don't do that.
We have to get rid of that. I mean, that.
Yes, we have to get rid of that.
There's a lot about Malcolm X that we need to learn from. That all of us are wrong sometimes. You're wrong with that one.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. If there are no other questions, We really want to thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.